So as you know from Becca's marvelous introduction, I am a science fiction studies professor, and I'm really interested in how it is we use science fiction as a global language. It's really the premier way that we talk about our experiences of science and technology and society to each other, across centuries and continents and cultures. And it's really exciting in particular to do this work at Georgia Tech because I can partner here with scientists and engineers who want to explore how technoscientific ideas are conveyed in these ways. And obviously I'm going to be doing that here with you today and talking specifically about how science fiction authors anticipate, dramatize, and extend our ideas about astrobiology. Now, I've promised to do a brief history of astrobiology from the 5th century BCE to the present, and I'm going to do this in about 40 minutes. So I do talk quickly. I will try to speak slowly. And one of the ways we're going to manage this huge chunk of storytelling is by focusing on 3 particular points where science fiction and science converge in really interesting ways. So we're going to look at explorations of exobiology, the origins of life, and planetary habitability, especially as it's linked to ideas about terraforming. All right. Now, before we do that, I do want to acknowledge that there's a really long history of speculative storytelling with astrobiological themes. And so really quickly, I want to acknowledge that history. And it's a truly global tradition, which is what makes it so exciting. So for instance, we can think about in the Ramayana, we have the Vimana flying machines associated with Lord Kubera and the Yaksha, who are semi-divine nature spirits. And what's interesting here is not so much that, obviously within the Ramayana, we're talking about gods and spirits, but the way that they're treated as almost alien others, it's very much anticipates what we're going to see in science fiction much, much later. And in fact, part of what's so interesting are all these diagrams and these detailed descriptions of the flying machines, because that's something you see time and time again in modern astrobiology science fiction, is that we measure the merits of an alien civilization based on its transportation technologies. So a kind of interesting connection over time and space. Of course, we also get things like Lucian's True History in the 2nd century Greece. And in True History, that's a satire of the kind of exaggeration that has always been associated with travel literature, but it also contains really serious speculation about worlds with other physical laws and the peoples who might conform to them. And this image here is a marvelous Art Deco rendering of a space battle in which the 2 different alien races who are fighting, I think for control of maybe our moon, they release these galactic spiders, these cosmic spiders, and the spiders spin webs, and that becomes the plane upon which a battle occurs. Pretty cool stuff. All right. Other kinds of stories we get are Kaguya Hime, which is the Japanese folktale of the bamboo cutter. And this is a story that revolves around an alien baby who's been hidden on Earth in order to survive celestial warfare. And in some ways, of course, I think a lot of you are thinking, that sounds a lot like Superman, and you're right to think that. What's particularly interesting, though, is that this tale is actually about a baby girl who's been hidden away from a celestial war. And she actually ends up revealing her true alien nature to the humans around her when they try to force her to be a good earthly girl and to get married. And instead she says, no, I'm going back to my people in the moon. And that is precisely what she does. So in fact, a lot of my colleagues now are talking about this as maybe the first feminist science fiction story, as well as one of the first astrobiology stories. Another great place where you see storytelling with astrobiological themes is in 1001 Nights from the Arabian Tales. And here in particular, there's one tale called The Adventures of Bulakia. And this revolves around a character whose quest for immortality leads him across the cosmos, where he meets all kinds of fantastic forms of life. So that takes us through very early astrobiological storytelling. We find the next wave of stories appear in early modern Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, and a whole cluster of stories show up at this time. And a lot of people will tell you this is really the moment when modern science fiction is just beginning to come together as a genre. So maybe it's no surprise we're seeing stories at this time. A few great ones that you might want to know about are Johann Kepler's Somnium from 1634. which imagines that life on the moon would have to be adapted to a longer day-night cycle. So again, speculating about the ways that different planets might produce different kinds of beings who would live in them. Another fun thing, if you don't know this, is that somnium was originally simply meant to be a mathematical proof of the way that the moon moves. And at that time, math was often written out in longhand, so it was very difficult to translate it from country to country. And so Kepler actually wrote this science fiction story to help dramatize his mathematical ideas. He felt that that would translate better to other cultures than the math it did itself. A fun fact to know and tell. If nothing else, you should all get great cocktail party out of this topic today. A few other early modern stories of note. Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World from 1666, which imagines sentient alien life extrapolated from Earth biology and imagines bioweaponry based on imagined alien life forms. And in fact, a human woman falls through a time-space portal, becomes the queen of this whole other species, and then brings them back so she can liberate her homeland on Earth. So that's a fun story. And then finally, Voltaire, the great philosopher, wrote science fiction. And in particular, I would call your attention to Micromegas, a story from 1752, in which human scientist explorers at the North Pole meet a scientist explorer from Jupiter and spend a lot of time exchanging information about their respective planets and life forms. It's a really boring story, especially by modern Hollywood standards. Nothing happens except that a bunch of scientists meet and get along and exchange ideas. Probably the most exciting part of the story in some ways is that this is the first time in human history, or at least in modern human history, that we see aliens as being represented as smarter than humans, and that's okay. In fact, this becomes a learning experience for the humans themselves. All right, and now finally, we are to true modern science fiction. And in the rest of this talk, we're going to be focusing on modern commercial science fiction published really in the 20th and 21st centuries. And we're going to start, as promised, with exobiology. Now, as I'm sure you all already know, the term exobiology was introduced by scientist Joshua Lederberg in 1960 to describe, and I quote, the disciplined construction of hypothetical alternatives to earthly biochemistry. Now, what you may or may not know is that the term that was used most commonly before the introduction of the phrase or the term exobiology was xenobiology. And that term was actually introduced not by a scientist, but a science fiction author. And the first use we find of xenobiology is in Robert Heinlein's Star Beast from 1954. Now, obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a difference in the way scientists versus science fiction authors explore issues of exobiology. So Lederberg, for instance, was specifically concerned with long-chain molecules and suitable suspension methods. And it is true that there are a number of science fiction authors also interested in that same issue. But what you're also going to find is that a lot of science fiction authors speculate much more broadly about patterns of evolution, ecological considerations, and potential forms of alien life. So two really great historic examples, one of which you probably already know and one of which you may not know. So the first of these is H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds from 1897. And this was not Wells's first novel, but it was really the novel that made him famous, that sealed his reputation as an author in this new genre of speculative literature. And as many of you probably remember, the plot of the War of the Worlds turns on, well, actually, I'm not going to say it in case some of you have never read the book or seen the story. All I'm going to say is that War of the Worlds, the whole plot turns on a certain assumption about differences in Martian versus earthly ecosystems. And I'll stop there. For those of you who do know the story, you know how it ends. You can fill in the rest of the blanks. For the rest of you, I hope this is like a really tantalizing and exciting thing, and now you'll go check out this story. Another really cool example of exobiology that I'm personally proud of because I'm the person who rediscovered it is a short story from 1929 called A Baby on Neptune by Claire Winger Harris and Miles J. Brewer. And Harris and Brewer were first generation science fiction authors. They helped build the popular commercial genre that we know today. And this was a really, really popular story. It kept ranking in like the top 10 stories of like the, you know, it was like top 3 of the issue, top 10 of the year, that kind of thing. Anyway, A Baby on Neptune links the discovery of life on Neptune to an understanding of how that planet's environment would necessarily produce a different, and in this case, it's a vaporous form of organic being. And it's a really neat story. At first, the humans and the vapor Neptunians, they really can't communicate very effectively. There's a lot of goodwill on both sides, but they're so different that they cannot find any way to communicate. And the event that ends up bringing humans and Neptunians together is the birth of a baby. I think that's really clever, really surprising for science fiction, but it makes sense in a case like this, where you've got someone like Claire Winger Harris, who was not only a proud mother of 3, but who had gotten a science degree at Smith College, which had some of the best science facilities in America at the time. And of course, Miles Brewer, who was a medical doctor. You know, for that instance, H.G. Wells was a science journalist. So clearly you have a lot of people really interested in both science and fiction who are bringing this together in early astrobiology science fiction storytelling. All right, so this is what's been happening, you know, more recently, by which I mean in the last 60 or 70 years in science fiction with exobiology. What you'll find is over time, scientists science fiction authors, much like scientists, become increasingly interested in the construction of really rigorous alternatives to earthly biochemistry. And this starts around mid-century with the advent of the space race, and it certainly continues today. Authors who write this kind of story tend to be associated with hard science fiction, and they tend to be particularly interested in alternative biochemistries where silicon is substituted for carbon, and ammonia and methane replace water as the medium for the suspension of life. There also tends to be very specific locales for these kinds of exobiology thought experiments. You're going to tend to see them, not surprisingly, in on planets and in spaces with what seem to us like unusual kinds of atmospheres or biology. So worlds with heavy gravity, stories that unfold in the atmospheres of gas giants, and planets in eccentric orbits around multiple stars. So a few of the examples I'd like to call your attention to are, for instance, Hal Clement's Mission of Gravity from 1953. This is considered the first really rigorous exobiology story, and Clement was celebrated for writing these kinds of stories and trying to think through different kinds of exobiologies, not just as they pertain to their own planet, but how different kinds of alien life forms might be able to interact with us or not interact with us, as the case may be. So in Mission of Gravity, you get the adventures of an intelligent life form from the planet Mesklin, which has a surface gravity of 700 Gs at the poles and 3 Gs at the equator. And so Clement imagines that these life forms would be centipedal in form in order to withstand that enormous gravity, and terrified of even small heights, because in these kinds of conditions, right, even a tiny fall could be fatal. And the cool thing with the story is you follow the alien centipede on its adventures around the planet. It's a very high-tech alien. It's got a ship. It's out exploring its North Pole. But it's in constant dialogue with humans who are orbiting the planet and trying to help the centipede with its mission. But of course, they can't come down to help them because they can't go onto the planet because of the heavy gravity. So, right, Mission of Gravity, it has, so many different meanings to it. It's a very, very cool story. Another great story you all might enjoy is Greg Benford and George Eklund's short story Anvil of Job, which was an award-winning, I believe, novella from 1976. And this explores how the different biochemistries of Earth and a gas giant like Jupiter would necessarily evolve different bodies and, more importantly, different mathematics with which to understand their worlds. And again, one of the reasons that this story is so celebrated is the first one to really think about how it is that alien worlds might yield not just different biologies and cultures, but different kinds of maths and sciences. More recently, of course, we've had Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem, which came out in 2007 and has swept all of the Chinese and American science fiction awards for its depiction of life on a planet in a deadly orbit around a triple star. As some of you may know, There was a full-length feature has just been made and released in China in the last couple of years, and I hope that we all get a chance to see it soon. Finally, last but certainly not least in this particular part, I want to direct your attention to a story by Caribbean science fiction author Tobias Buckell called A Jar of Goodwill. This story was originally published in 2010 and recently republished in a new astrobiology science fiction anthology published by the European Space Agency. And that's free. You can go download that online. So if you just go Google around for it, or I can drop that link in later if you're interested. Anyway, A Jar of Goodwill explores the ethics of human colonization and exploitation of already inhabited exoplanets. And that's a theme that we're going to see increasingly in astrobiology science fiction. That's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about as we get to the end of this talk. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the origins of life, another popular astrobiology theme in science fiction. Obviously, in science, this is one of NASA's earliest core goals, right? To search for life signatures beyond Earth. And that opens up questions about the origins of life here on Earth itself. Earlier, someone had been talking, I remember someone mentioned the Miller 1953 paper about experiments catalyzing amino acids, right? One of the first papers to give proof that life might have spontaneously generated here on Earth. Now, in science fiction, authors have been interested in dramatizing theories of life since the beginning of the genre, right? And the first place we see that is in one of the first stories we associate with science or modern science fiction, and that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818. Frankenstein dramatized the 18th century theory of life as a kind of vital electricity, right? And you see that through the creation of the creature. And I've decided to post an image from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I like to really call Kenneth Branagh's Frankenstein, because it's really all about Branagh. And whatever you think of the movie, it does have an incredibly marvelous depiction of life. And I think it's a lovely demonstration, visual demonstration of how people thought about vital electricity in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, vitalism pervades most science fiction until the 1950s, when authors and directors alike began to embrace modern theories that complex life originated in water and gradually evolved over millions of years. And in fact, in 1954, just 1 year after the Miller paper, Jack Arnold's 1954 film, Creature from the Black Lagoon, actually began with a really thoughtful discussion of the origins of life that largely follows along with what was then really brand new cutting edge thinking about this. And of course, it veers off into the fun but completely fantastic premise that there might be amphibious life forms with humanoid features hiding in Earth's waters. Right. Now, that same theory informs the very final episode of Star Trek Next Generation. If you've ever seen it, and even if you haven't, you should go check it out. Such a great series. In that final episode, Captain Picard must jump through multiple timelines to stop an anomaly that threatens to prevent the formation of life on Earth. And there's a marvelous scene in which he's rewarded in the end with being able to go all the way back in time and literally physically witness the formation of life on Earth. And it's pretty impressive for 1994 television graphics. A more recent iteration of this, or variant of this, is the short animated film by New Zealand director Richard Manns called Abiogenesis from 2011. This is a 5-minute short film, utterly beautiful, in which a strange mechanical device lands on a barren planet and starts a surprising transformation with galaxy-spanning results. You can probably, again, fill in some of those blanks for yourself, but it's beautiful to see how this is visually handled, and just such a celebration of this idea. Really lovely. And one thing you'll notice that in a lot of other slides, I've focused on print science fiction, and in part that's because I'm a book person. I'll be the first to admit it. But one thing I really noticed when I was doing research for this talk is that stories about the origins of life tend to take visual form. And I think that really absolutely makes sense, right? Because how much fun is it to actually see theories of life dramatized in different media? It's cool. And in some ways, a lot more moving than what happens sometimes in science fiction, where someone asks a question and then Professor Exposition has to pull out her pipe and light it and launch into a long explanation, and everyone patiently waits while she gets through that. Okay, so then let's go on to the origins of life, part 2. And again, this is going to be more modern science fiction, beginning in 1934 and moving truly into the present here. All right, so one of the things that we find is science fiction authors are always really interested in stories about panspermia, or the notion that life might spread around the universe by drifting spores or seeds. I think in part, some of that is what's interesting, right, is that this was an idea that was popularized by Sir Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer and science fiction author, who talked about this quite seriously in the 1970s and 80s. And again, I think it's interesting that we have these hinge people who are connected to both science and science fiction, really involved in working out these ideas. So, of course, while Hoyle was writing in the 70s and 80s, science fictional dramatizations of panspermia go all the way back to the 1930s. And one of the most famous and fun of those is H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, which posits that life on Earth evolved from the garbage left here by ancient aliens, a fact that makes humans who discover it go completely insane. Now, we're going to see a proliferation of these kinds of stories, panspermia stories, in the 1970s, probably because that's the point at which Hoyle is himself writing about this in both his scientific writing and his fiction writing. So, for instance, Ursula K. Le Guin's Hainish cycle uses this concept really, really thoughtfully. Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain provides an extremely paranoid take on it. And Doug Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy treats the concept of panspermia satirically. In recent decades, we've seen dramatizations of the panspermia theory in things like the 2008 video game Spore, in which players must evolve a single cell that has been dropped into the ocean. Super cute little anime-looking creatures. And then finally, this is something I just found, and this is the book I was just recommending. You should all Google and download. So Julie Novakova's Martian Fever, it's a short story from 2019, which explores the possibility of indigenous Martian life and the question of lithopanspermia between Earth and Mars. So it's a very modern take on this, and it's in the anthology Strangest of All, which is a free anthology, like I said, released by the European Space Union. It was supposed to happen for a conference last year that got canceled due to the pandemic, but the anthology went out anyway. And so I'm excited that I can celebrate it now as we're at our own conference online. All right, here we go into the final area that I want to talk about with you today, which is terraforming. So science and science fiction intersect in critical ways around the concepts of planetary habitability, especially as it relates to terraforming. The term terraforming was actually coined by science fiction author Jack Williamson in the 1942 story Collision Orbit. And I've put the picture, the black and white drawing from that up there for you to check out. This idea gets taken up in the 1960s and 70s by scientist and science fiction author Carl Sagan, who called it planetary engineering. Now, NASA itself has recognized strong connections between science fiction, and terraforming, such as in the 2004 debate series called Science Fiction Meets Science Fact. The first debate, Terraforming Mars, was a joint production of NASA's Astrobiology magazine and the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, featuring authors Arthur C. Clarke and Kim Stanley Robinson, as well as planetary scientists and planetary protection officers from NASA. Now, as is often the case, science fiction authors dreamed of terraforming well before it had a proper name or was really being explored particularly seriously, either by scientists or lay people out in popular culture. So, for instance, Olaf Stapledon's 1930 epic Last and First Men is a great example where Venus is prepared for human habitation by electrolyzing water from its oceans to produce oxygen. In a similar vein, Leslie F. Stone's 1931 short story, The Conquest of Gola, imagines a matriarchal society from Venus, which goes to war against a group of Earthmen who want to take over the world, terraform away its cloud cover, and transform Venus into the perfect vacation spot for Martians and humans. By the way, the women of Venus win, in case you were wondering, and no terraforming happens. But, all right. Here are some other stories that treat terraforming in maybe some of the complex ways that even Stone herself was anticipating when she imagined that groups of people might not always agree on when and how and what to terraform. And in fact, we're going to see this. So terraforming projects and debates about terraforming projects become increasingly common in science fiction and increasingly well extrapolated, of course, as new scientific data has made it increasingly clear that other planets in our solar system couldn't sustain human life without some sort of intervention. Not surprisingly, Venus was and still remains a popular candidate for terraforming in science fiction. But by the 1950s, you're going to see a major shift as many scientists and many science fiction authors turn their attention to the possibility of terraforming Mars. And one of the first really famous examples of this is Arthur C. Clarke's 1951 novel, The Sands of Mars. In the 1970s, serious treatments of terraforming had become the norm in science fiction, and authors started to look further afield for planets to terraform. One of the most lauded books in this vein is David Gerrold's 1977 Moonstar Odyssey, which describes the terraforming of a dry, airless rock planet in another solar system in very realistic detail. Right around that same time, we get a great visual representation in Nicholas Meyer's Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, right? And in some ways, that provides one of the most memorable visual representations of terraforming via the Genesis device. And I didn't give you a picture of it here, but I recommend you can go either watch short video clips from that last part of the movie when they trigger the Genesis device, or even just look at like the blueprints and the images. They're all over the internet. It's very well detailed, as often happens in science fiction. And then finally, of course, we have to talk about Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy from the 1990s. A lot of people will tell you this is absolutely the gold standard for stories about terraforming, and especially about terraforming Mars, because it calls attention to both the scientific and social ramifications of this hypothetical process. And so the kinds of tensions between groups that Leslie Stone gestured towards in the 1930s really becomes the center of the drama and the action in a story like Red Mars, where we have groups of humans from different parts of the world, as well as the humans who then become Martians versus humans still on Earth, debating what the future of Mars should be. Now, this Kim Stanley Robinson trilogy has been so influential that it actually inspired the 2016 board game Terraforming Mars, which has been the winner of multiple awards and is currently the fourth highest ranked board game in the world. I'd actually never heard of this game before I did this work today, but I got to tell you, it has made its way into my Amazon box and it's on the way to my house now. So I'll have to let you know if it's any good. If any of you've played it, you'll have to let me know what you think. All right, now this slide is called Terraforming 3, but in some ways, I think I really should have called this slide the future of astrobiology science fiction. These are all a series of very, very recent stories that mark a certain shift in the ways we think about astrobiology in science fiction. And these are complicated stories. I think that whereas earlier stories either tended to either sort of heroically imagine terraforming or to imagine it as a potentially dystopian tool for oppressing other people, you're going to see modern stories often say it's a lot more complicated than either of those extremes. And that's probably not surprising because it is. All right, so for instance, Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, I had mentioned that Robinson is often celebrated as having written the definitive books on terraforming, and the Mars books ultimately celebrate the possibility that humans can indeed negotiate a viable way of terraforming Mars. Aurora asks a very different question, and it says, what if we go out to terraform other worlds, but it turns out we are allergic to every planet out there except Earth? Obviously, a story that asks important questions, including how is it that we could care for or even terraform our own planet if we can't get off it for any sustained amounts of time? I think another great astrobiology story that I hope some of you are familiar with is The Expanse, which has been running on the Sci-Fi Channel and now Amazon for about 5 years. This is based on a series written by J.A. Corey, which is the pseudonym of two authors whose names I'm forgetting right now. But anyways, The Expanse, if you haven't been watching it, asks a couple different questions. In general, one of the questions it asks is, what if we went to space and started terraforming Mars, only to find that there were other habitable planets in another galaxy and we could get to them? And then in particular, the most recent season of The Expanse, the last 2 seasons, has really followed that question. What would happen to terraforming in a moment like that and all the economies that depend on it? Another story about terraforming that is very thoughtful, and in fact, I'd say a little bit unnerving, and this is part of why I recommend it, is Rivers Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts from 2017. And this book asks a really scary question, but one that in its own way is worth asking. What if the only way we could enact the kinds of astrobiological projects that we currently imagine was to re-enslave all of the world's brown and black people and reinstitute chattel slavery like we used to have in the United States? It's a serious book. It asks serious questions. And I think it really reminds us of the human labor that goes into these kinds of projects, and the ways we do and don't value that labor. Other stories more recently have asked some other questions, turning the mirror of terraforming back onto us as humans. So for instance, Sue Burke's Semiosis from 2018 says, what if we go to terraform another planet, only to realize that the plants are sentient and they've been manipulating us for their own survival and prosperity? Finally, and this is absolutely hands down one of my favorite book series, maybe ever, certainly of the last 5 years, is Nigerian author Tade Thompson's Rosewater trilogy, which asks a couple different questions. What if the whole history of science fiction was wrong and aliens decided to invade not Great Britain, not the United States, not the Soviet Union, but Nigeria? And then what if those same aliens terraformed Earth's atmosphere and by extension all of Earth's inhabitants for their own survival? Finally, it asks the question, how would Nigerians who've already faced their own kinds of contact with the alien other and issues of colonization through the history of contact with both, medieval trade with China and then later, of course, trade with the West, how is it those experiences of negotiating alien cultures on Earth might enable us to negotiate alien cultures who come with intent to change our own world? So, great questions, and these are books that sometimes have some really great answers and sometimes leave it up to you to ask these things. So now I'm going to wrap up really quickly by just addressing maybe what I hope isn't the elephant in the room, but might be, but like, why science fiction? Why is it that we want to talk about science fiction? You all today have been so great thinking through issues of interdisciplinarity, and it's been really fun for me to think about the ways that scientists and people from the liberal arts can collaborate and work together on these projects related to astrobiology. And that's why I think it's important to think about science fiction. This is another tool we can use to do science and to think about the relations of science and society. So obviously, I hope I've entertained you here today with this brief history of astrobiology. But like I said, I want to give you a new way to think about science fiction itself as well. Science fiction has long served as a virtual laboratory where scientists can explore ideas outside the parameters of standard scientific practice. At the same time, it's been a virtual town hall for lay people who want to contribute to widespread cultural debates over the proper relations of science, technology, and society, but who might otherwise not have the ability to do so. And in fact, that's why I wanted to conclude not just with this thought, but with this particular piece of art that I'm showing you here. This art, as the artist writes on his this is from artstation.com, which is an amazing place to find astrobiology art. And as this Italian artist noted, this piece of art was, quote unquote, inspired by the photographs of rocks taken by NASA's Curiosity rover that may confirm that life as we know it once existed on Mars. Here, I've represented that by an old giant fossil creature. And so I think, again, this is really proof that science fiction is a laboratory, a town hall, and perhaps most fun and best of all, a playground for all of us who are interested in building new and better futures. Thank you.